To week 12 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few quarterbacks I would look to get on the waiver wire this week. The first guy, Taylor Heineke of the Washington football team. So it's been an up and down season here for Heineke on the year, but he had a decent ball game in week 11 was Heineke versus the Carolina Panthers in Carolina. Week 11, 206 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 29 yards rushing. So the last few games for Heineke, it's been an up and down type of ball games for him. Week 8 at Denver, 270 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions, 10 rushing yards. Week 10 versus Tampa Bay in that ball game, 256 passing yards, a touchdown, and 15 rushing yards. And like I mentioned at the Panthers, he had a good one, 206 yards and 3 TDs. So right here in week 12, it's not the greatest of matchups versus the Seattle Seahawks defense. But we just saw Colt McCoy have a pretty good game versus them in week 11. And right here, the Seahawks give up the ninth least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But Heineke, he's got some decent weapons in that offense with Antonio Gibson, Terry McLaurin, obviously, and Logan Thomas. So I think here Heineke could put up a decent performance if you need a quarterback in deeper leagues or 2 quarterback leagues. And he's available in 75% of fantasy leagues. The next quarterback's Cam Newton of the Carolina Panthers. So Cam in his first start back in almost a year here. I'm not going to lie, he looked good, no doubt about it. 189 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 46 rushing yards, and a touchdown. So right here, it was a good matchup on paper in week 10 at the Washington football team that gives up the most fantasy points to QBs on the season. And coming into week 11, Cam got added in 35% of fantasy leagues. And now he's still available, though, in 49% of fantasy leagues. And in week 12, he's got another great matchup at the Miami Dolphins that give up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. We just saw Joe Flacco have a pretty decent game versus Miami. So I think Cam Newton in week 12 before they go on bye in week 13 is a valuable option in 10 and 12 team leagues. And I could see him once again score anywhere from 23 to 30 fantasy points in week 12. And he's definitely a quarterback I would look to get on the wire this week. The next quarterback I look to get this week is Jimmy Garoppolo of the San Francisco 49ers. So this 49er team, they've turned it around over the last month of the season here since Jimmy G came off his injury. And he's playing good football. Week 9 versus Arizona, 326 passing yards, 2 touchdowns and 3 rushing yards. Week 10 versus the Rams in another victory, 182 passing yards, 2 touchdowns in that one. And week 11 in Jacksonville, they didn't need a huge game out of him, but he still had 19 fantasy points, was Garoppolo, 176 passing yards, 2 touchdowns in that ball game. So week 12 here, another good matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings, who we've seen teams go up and down the field a lot on them this season here. And right now, San Francisco's playing good football. Jimmy G's finding Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk's finally playing a major role once again this season. And he's got confidence, and he's a good addition to fantasy rosters, especially with bye weeks and injuries on your team. So right now, he's available in 72% of fantasy leagues, and he's definitely a quarterback I look to get on the wire this week. The next quarterback's Andy Dalton of the Chicago Bears. So we saw in this one a crazy ball game it was in week 11 with the Bears and the Ravens, but the Ravens pulled it out at the end. But anyway, Andy Dalton filling in for Justin Fields, who went down with a bad rib injury, which I doubt he's going to play on Thanksgiving in Thursday's ball game at the Detroit Lions. Dalton came in relief, and I thought they had that game after he hit Goodwin on that deep ball, 201 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. So right now, he's available in 100% of fantasy leagues. And he's more of a traditional quarterback, in my opinion, than Justin Fields. Fields, for me, looks to hold on to the ball too long, and he always looks for those running lanes. But right here, Andy Dalton on Thanksgiving at a weak Detroit team that's 0-9-1 on the season, I think he could be a decent option, especially in 2 quarterback leagues, and especially if Allen Robinson gets back. He fits with Robinson more than Fields does, in my opinion. So right now, if you're in a big pinch, a deep league or 2 QB leagues, Dalton's worth an add with that matchup on Thanksgiving Day. And the 5th and final quarterback I would add this week's Joe Flacco with the New York Jets. So Joe Flacco, he looked good versus the Miami Dolphins in that week 11 loss, though. 291 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 rushing yards, and a fumble loss. So right here, it looks like Flacco's going to start at least one more week, because there's been no news on Zach Wilson when he's going to return. Mike White had his opportunity, had one big game and a couple poor games. So right here, week 12, a good matchup for Joe Flacco at the Houston Texans that give up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So I could see Flacco in this one. Once again, not a crazy game, but 200, 250 yards and maybe 2 touchdowns and 2 windows. Because the Jets, believe it or not, they have some decent weapons on the outside. Jamison Crowder, who had a good game in this one. Elijah Moore, who's definitely emerged over the last month of the season for the Jets. So right here, he's got something to work with, Flacco, and he's got a good matchup. But right now, it's more in the deeper leagues, obviously. I will look to get him available in 98% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few quarterbacks I look to get on the wire heading into week 12 of the fantasy football season.